The winter sun hung low over the prairie, spilling pale gold across the dust, but it didn't warm her. They called her the widow in the cage. Locked behind rusted bars in the center of town, Margaret stood alone, her dress, torn, her face marked by nights without rest. No one spoke to her. No one dared. They all knew the whispers. She was trouble, cursed, dangerous to stand beside. For 3 days she endured the cold stares and colder wind, until a shadow broke through the crowd. A tall, quiet man in a worn coat and silver-threaded hair stepped forward. Caleb, the lonely rancher no one truly knew, placed a handful of coins on the sheriff's desk and spoke only 4 words. "You're safe now, ma'am." But safety in the Wild West was never certain. Because Caleb didn't yet know the truth, the secret Margaret carried, the danger that would follow her to his land, and the choice he'd soon have to make, between protecting his heart or protecting her life. What happened on that snowbound ranch would test them both, not with gunfire or gallows, but with the quiet, unrelenting weight of trust. And when the past came riding for her, Margaret would have to decide: run again, or finally stand her ground. The summer sun in Dry Creek did not shine, it punished. By mid-morning, the dust along Main Street had risen so thick you could taste it, and the wooden planks outside the saloon were hot enough to blister a bare foot. In the square, a crude cage stood on display like some cruel carnival attraction. Inside sat Margaret Hale, her back straight, despite the weight of 50 hard-lived years. Her hair, silver threaded through chestnut, was pinned neatly under a faded bonnet. The skin around her eyes was lined not just from age, but from a lifetime of squinting at horizons that never brought good news. They said she was a thief, a liar, a woman who'd run her husband into the grave and taken his kin's money for herself. They didn't say that her husband had been twice her age, had chosen her because her father owed him and had kept her in a house where the shutters stayed closed even on bright days. They didn't say she'd been widowed without a cent and hunted by in-laws who wanted her gone. Children ran past the cage, tossing pebbles for sport. A shopkeeper crossed the street rather than look her in the eye. Every hour the sheriff walked by, checking the lock, not because she might run, but because he wanted the town to see her there. In the distance, a rider approached Caleb Ward, a man most folks only knew by the sound of his boots in the general store, and the fact that he never stayed long. He slowed when he saw her. "Buy her out if you're curious," the sheriff drawled. Caleb's eyes never left hers. Margaret didn't flinch under his gaze, but in her chest something she'd long thought dead shifted. Sometimes the cruelest prison isn't the bars, it's the eyes that look away. What would it mean if someone didn't? The sound of Caleb Ward's boots on the packed earth carried farther than most men's words. He stopped in front of the cage, the sheriff leaning back in his chair with a lazy smirk. How much? Caleb's voice was low even. For her, the sheriff laughed like he'd just been told the punchline of a joke. "Ain't worth the trouble, but fine $2 to settle the fine. Then she's your problem." Coins clinked against the sheriff's desk, and before Margaret could speak, the key turned. The door swung open. She stepped out slowly, her spine still straight, her hands folded in front of her. She didn't thank him, didn't trust her voice to hold. "You're safe now," Caleb said almost under his breath. Safe. She rolled the word over in her mind like a pebble, smooth, unbelievable. Men had called her many things. Safe had never been one of them. He didn't lead her to his horse like a man rescuing a lady in distress. Instead, he handed her the reins, mounted his own, and nodded toward the road. They rode in silence, the sun dipping low, painting the prairie in colors so soft they felt like a lie after the day's heat. She kept waiting for the question, what had she done? Why had she been in the cage? Did she deserve it? It never came. At the edge of his land, a weathered ranch house stood beside a barn that looked older than both of them. "You can stay here till you figure where to go," he said. "Why?" Her voice was quiet, but the question carried. Caleb dismounted, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "Because I've seen good people caged before." That night, Margaret lay in a small spare room, the sheets smelling faintly of cedar. The wind rattled the window, and for the first time in years, she wondered if she might wake tomorrow and not be afraid. What happens when the walls come down but the chains inside remain? Morning came with the scent of coffee and the low wicker of horses. Margaret dressed in the same faded dress she'd worn for 3 days, smoothing the wrinkles as though that might smooth the edges of herself. In the kitchen, Caleb was already at the table pouring black coffee into a chipped mug. He didn't look up when she entered, just slid the mug across to her. Biscuits are on the stove. She poured one onto her plate, still warm, still soft, and took a small bite. You expecting me to work for it? She asked, keeping her tone sharper than she intended. Caleb shook his head. You're not in debt to me. That answer unsettled her more than if he'd demanded she muck the stalls. Men always wanted something. By midday, she found herself outside watching him mend a fence. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, like someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. When he caught her watching, he said, You can help if you want. She hesitated, then took a hammer. Her hands remembered the motion muscles pulling tight with each strike. It felt good, grounding, honest. But just when her breathing began to steady, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Two men rode up the road, dust in their wake. Margaret stiffened. Morning ward, one of them called. You keeping the widow as company these days? His smirk was slow, cruel. Town says she's trouble. Margaret felt her chest tighten. Caleb didn't flinch. Town says a lot of things. I don't buy every story they sell. The men laughed and rode on, but the words had already sunk their hooks. That night, Margaret sat in the spare room staring at the dark. She'd known it was only a matter of time before the whispers followed her here. Good men in her experience eventually listened to them. She told herself she should leave before Caleb did the same. Will she run from the first place that's offered her shelter, or risk trusting it? 3 days later, the whispers took form. Margaret was returning from the well with a bucket of water when she saw the preacher's wife, Mrs. Talbot, standing at the gate. The woman's smile was tight, her eyes sharper than the pins she kept in her hat. Morning, Mrs. Ward, she said sweetly, though she didn't step forward. Or should I call you Miss Margaret still? I hear your last husband didn't leave much behind. Margaret set the bucket down slowly. He left more than you'd know what to do with. Mrs. Talbot's eyes narrowed. We look out for our own in this town. A woman with your history could stir up trouble. Margaret kept her voice even. Trouble usually finds me without my asking. Caleb appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Something you need, Mrs. Talbot? The woman glanced at him, her tone shifting into syrup. Only making sure you know who you've taken in. Folks say she's been through 3 men. One left, one died, one threw her out. Bad luck tends to spread. Caleb stepped closer to the gate. Luck's got nothing to do with it. She's under my roof, and that's all you need to know. Mrs. Talbot's smile faltered. Well, I'll pray for you both. She turned, skirts swishing, and left the dust behind her words. Margaret's chest ached, not from the insult, but from the way Caleb had stood there steady as oak. Men didn't usually defend her, not without wanting something. That night at supper, neither spoke of the encounter, but when Caleb slid the bread toward her, his fingers brushed hers just enough to make her pause. She looked at him, searching for judgment. She found none. That scared her more than the rumors. If a man sees you without turning away, can you bear to let him keep looking? The morning sun spilled over the horizon in slow gold, washing the barn and corral in gentle light. Margaret stood on the porch, shawl around her shoulders, watching Caleb hitch the wagon. He didn't glance back, but his movements were purposeful, almost as if he knew she was there. I'm going into town, he said finally. Need anything? Margaret hesitated. Normally she would have asked for flour or lamp oil, something small, unremarkable. But today the words that rose surprised her. Yes, she said. I'll come with you. Caleb paused mid-buckle. You sure? She nodded. I'm tired of hiding from their stares. The road into town was rutted and dry, the wheels humming low against the dirt. When they reached the main street, heads turned. Margaret felt the weight of every glance, pity from some, suspicion from others. Her hands clenched in her lap. Caleb drove straight to the general store. Inside, conversation stilled. She could feel the preacher's wife's eyes from across the room. Margaret stepped past Caleb, past the counter, and placed her list directly in front of Mr. Avery, the storekeeper. Flour, sugar, soap, and 2 yards of blue calico, she said evenly. Mr. Avery's brows rose, but he began measuring cloth without a word. Somewhere behind her, Mrs. Talbot whispered to another woman. Margaret didn't turn. When they left, Caleb didn't speak until they were halfway home. You looked him in the eye, he said quietly. Not many can. Margaret let the corner of her mouth lift. Not many ever bothered to teach me I could. That night she baked biscuits, light warm, the smell drifting through the house. Caleb took one, broke it in half, and said, "Reckon you're starting to fit here." Margaret met his gaze. "I'm starting to think I might want to. When you've been caged most of your life, can you trust the open door enough to step through?" The first frost came quietly, silvering the pasture grass and glazing the fence rails. Margaret woke early, wrapping herself in a wool shawl, and found Caleb already outside, his breath clouding the cold air as he checked the horses. Over the past weeks, the sharp edges between them had softened. He still spoke little, but his silence no longer felt like distance, more like steady ground. She had started leaving small touches of herself in the house: a crocheted blanket over the chair by the fire, a jar of dried lavender in the kitchen window. Caleb never mentioned them, but she noticed how he lingered near them, as if these traces of her made the place warmer. That morning she brought him coffee out by the fence. He took the mug with a simple, "Thank you," but their eyes held for a fraction longer than usual. "They still talk in town," Margaret said, blowing on her hands. "They will," Caleb replied, "but you're still here. That's what matters." Later, when the sun climbed higher, Caleb handed her a small wrapped parcel. Inside was a length of deep green wool, the richest color she'd ever owned. "Thought you might want something warm," he said. Her throat tightened. "Why?" he shrugged. "Because you deserve more than just surviving." That night, Margaret wore the shawl as they ate supper. The fire crackled, the wind pressed against the windows, and in the quiet between spoonfuls she realized something she hadn't felt in decades: not just safety, but belonging. When a heart has learned only to survive, how does it begin to believe in a life worth staying for? The snow came early that year, soft, steady, and unhurried, like it had no interest in rushing through the season. By morning, the ranch lay under a white hush, every fence post crowned in frost, every tree branch draped in stillness. Margaret woke to find Caleb already in the kitchen, a pot of stew simmering low. He glanced up when she entered, his eyes softening in that way he never spoke about. "There's something I need to show you," he said. He led her to the old barn, where a fresh coat of paint now covered the weathered boards. Inside, the empty stall where she'd once slept in fear had been transformed a rocking chair by the wall shelves lined with jars of preserves and a thick rug underfoot. "You made this for me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For us," Caleb said simply. "Figured every home needs a place for quiet." Margaret traced her fingers along the smooth wood, feeling the care in every nail, every brushstroke. In that moment she realized this wasn't pity or obligation. This was a man choosing her not for what she could offer, but for who she was. From the hill above, the town might still whisper, but inside these walls the only voices that mattered were their own. As they stood there, snow tapping gently at the roof, Margaret felt something lift inside her, a heaviness she'd carried for decades finally loosening its grip. For the first time in years, she stepped forward without fear, placing her hand in his. "Sometimes the world doesn't change, but you find someone who makes it feel like it has. Would you stand beside them no matter the noise?" Out on that quiet stretch of prairie under skies that seemed to go on forever, Margaret finally found a place where she could breathe without looking over her shoulder. And Caleb, he discovered that sometimes saving someone else is the surest way to save yourself. Life in the West had a way of hardening people, but it could also surprise you, giving you second chances in the most unlikely shapes. Margaret didn't need a rescuer, and Caleb didn't need a heroine. They just needed each other to keep walking forward one day at a time. Maybe that's what love really is, not the grand gestures or the perfect words, but the quiet, steady promise: "I'll stand with you, no matter what comes." And maybe for those of us who've been through storms, that's enough to start again. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear from you. Would you want to see what comes next for Margaret and Caleb? Or hear more Wild West tales of courage, kindness, and love that arrives when we least expect it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your words matter here. And if you'd like more stories like this, remember to subscribe to Wild West Saga. Because out here, there's always another story waiting. And it just might be the one that heals you.